I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're starting a two-part series, a short series dedicated to the entirety of a novel, Chen Qiufan's Wast Tide. It's a science fiction novel that was published in Chinese in 2013, came out in English a couple of years later. There's an audiobook edition on Audible and other modalities if you want to take a listen to it. I was going to try and explain the plot, Rob. You were the fan of science fiction, so maybe you should explain the plot.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And in fact, the reason I brought this up is, well, for a lot of reasons, but science fiction has a huge presence in China, and it's one of the only popular formats, entertainment formats coming out of China that has a huge international audience, like a lot of respect internationally.
Liu Cixin particularly has become a major phenomenon in American science fiction circles and all non-Chinese science fiction circles. We did an episode on his three-body problem, which is insanely popular, and I have to say I don't like it. Rob, you liked it.
Well, we could actually bring that in later in this discussion, because one of the reasons I liked it was what it did with certain conventions of science fiction, which if you don't know those conventions or don't care about them, it's not really going to grab you all that much. But that's the other reason I kind of suggested this one, because Chen Qiufan is also a fairly well-known science fiction writer. We already covered one of his stories, The Year of the Rat, which we both really liked.
I really liked everything we read in that collection, Qin Liu's Invisible Planets, and so I was looking forward to reading Chen Qiufan, because so often I have trouble dealing with science fiction.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to summarize the plot. Now, the reason this is a two-parter is because there's more going on in this book than just stuff we like or don't like. There's also things about the genre in general. I think it's on kind of display here. So I'll just jump in and give it as quick a plot summary as I can. The novel concerns an island, effectively, called Silicon Isle, just off the southern coast of China, that recycles e-waste. The actual name of the place, Guiyu, is very, very similar to the actual name of the town where Chen Qiufan was born. So it's a sort of, not semi-autobiographical, but it draws from real life because it involves e-waste, it involves real-world stuff. So Silicon Isle recycles e-waste, and it's a classic sort of workers and rich people scenario where there are several clans that control the waste recycling and get all the money, and then you have the quote-unquote waste people, as they are negatively titled, who do all the nasty stuff, like the stripping of wiring and recycling things and basically taking the brunt of the environmental disaster. Lots of pollution, lots of sickness, and all that stuff. Now, into the mix of this comes a Western firm called Terra Green Recycling that's trying to set up a sort of green recycling plant on the island, and they're negotiating with one of the clans about how to set this up. Alongside this, there is a young woman named Mimi who, through an accident involving a piece of e-waste, how do I put this? Effectively sort of becomes the psychic savior of the waste people.
It's the kind of Spider-Man gets bit by a radioactive spider moment. She's, she gets superpowers from this e-waste.
Mimi, through a sort of an accident, gets contaminated by a high-tech virus, becomes the leader of or at least the manager of a rebellion against the clans by the waste people. And I'm not going to spoil it by saying what happens, but the Western firm gets kind of sucked into it. The guy who represents them and his translator in particular get deeply involved in it, and it will affect forever the industry of waste recycling in that part of China. So that's a capsule plot. There were a lot of early critics of the genre way back in the day that said science fiction's at its best when it's a short story. As soon as you get into novels, it starts to kind of go off the rails. Do you see something like that happening here, or does it kind of work for you?
It did not work for me. Sorry, Rob. I'll just be blunt. Chen Qiufan's short story Year of the Rat was excellent, and I was expecting something similar from this novel, but it really didn't do it for me. And I think there are a variety of reasons. I think that it was tough to care about the characters just because they were kind of poorly developed. And this is not just me speaking. I actually, before the podcast, looked up the novel on Goodreads, the book lovers social network, and on the reviews on Goodreads suggested that a lot of other people were having trouble caring about these characters. I think Chen Qiufan does a good job in The Year of the Rat with the kind of cool concept of that story. And he does a good job with the concept. There are a lot of cool concepts in this novel, but there's not really that much characterization. And in a short story, you can kind of get away with the lack of characterization, or at least very minimal characterization, because you just don't have that much space. But a novel requires a bit more development. And I think that part of Chen Qiufan's problem here is related to genre, and part of it's related to just his maturity. This is his first novel that he's ever written, and anybody who's ever tried to write a novel knows how hard it is to kind of pull off that perfect balance. Even a good writer like Chen Qiufan is gonna have trouble with that. So I think maturity is one issue, but I think a larger issue, and this is an issue I have with the entire genre of science fiction, is...
Except for the stuff you like.
Sure. But the genre itself has a tendency to, because of its kind of gimmicky focus, it's focused on science, right? Like, it's built around these kind of cool ideas. Science fiction writers tend to, not entirely, but there is a common complaint that I have with science fiction and that other literati have voiced, that science fiction just doesn't do the basics of writing really well. They focus on so much on this cool idea, and then they forget to do characters and do plot really well. I felt like some of that was happening with Chen Qiufan's Wast Tide, and I think that if the listener is concerned that Rob rambled a bit in his plot summary, part of the reason is not just because Rob is very rambly, which is definitely true. Which is true. But it's also because this novel is just kind of a hot mess, right? Like, it's trying to tackle a bunch of different things. Like, in the beginning, it seemed like it was focusing on this environmental theme, e-waste, and kind of humans' interaction with the environment. And I was like, whoa, this is a really cool idea. And then it brought on this idea of class. You have the classes on Silicon Isle who are natives of Silicon Isle, and you have the migrant workers. And I was like, well, kind of cool. But it was not really, those two themes didn't gel super well. And then, like, he kept bringing on these different themes. And I remember 3/4 of the way through the novel, I'm about 75% into the novel, and he brings on this other theme of, like, humans' relationship with technology and pleasure, and this kind of, like, what is real joy, essentially, was the question he was asking. I was like, we're almost through with this novel. How can you you pull this off? And you've already touched on so many different things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think a lot of, and as someone who professes to be a fan of the genre, I also dislike a huge quantity of the genre. So I'm not sure what that says about me, but my experience is, and I would agree that a lot of the stuff I don't like, that's what it is. It's, oh, look how cool this starship is, or isn't this awesome, this toy we just developed? Like, they have to go into detail, and you're like, I really don't care all that much about it. And
you know what that aspect of science fiction genre reminds me of?
What's that?
Do you know the poetic genre of the Fu that was a big deal in the Han Dynasty? Like, it's just, those poems are really just list of stuff. They're like list of things that are using really fancy words. It's science fiction, and particularly Chen Qiufan's writing kind of did something similar, where it was just like, here are all these cool ideas, and it didn't focus on any one of them enough to develop them.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder if, when you read the backstory of the novel, Chen Qiufan did choose to have his hometown as the setting of the novel. I mean, he calls it something a little different it's set in a slightly different place and it's in the future, etc. But effectively, he's taking a lot of local politics and putting them on display. A lot of times, I don't know if you've ever tried this, Lee, but anytime I've ever tried to write something in fiction that really grapples with something real in my own life, I've never been able to pull it off. It's unbelievably hard because it's like you feel it so deeply, you feel like you have to approach it from every possible angle. And so here you sort of see in the beginning, you go, oh, this is one of those Western firms, rich people and poor people situations. All right, I'm down with that. But then it has to branch out into, local lore and history, Chinese culture, so many other things, which I'm sure the author feels deeply. But at some point, you're like, yeah, we now have 18 different threads going here, none of which is really being followed up that much. Hey, so I'm curious, though, before we dig into all the threads, just imagine for a second that the novel stopped its throwing all the things into the pot approach about 50 pages in. When you have when the book starts out with this Terra Green recycling, trying to negotiate with one of the clans. Then they go visit one of these waste people villages. Then Mimi gets infected with this virus. Imagine if that story, they just stuck with that. If Chen just stuck with that. Would you find it interesting, or did that one idea leave you cold?
I mean, it's a cool idea, but, I just realized something. We haven't even mentioned Chen Kaizong's name. Chen Kaizong is another, I'm trying to think of how we even talk about this novel, because I don't even know who the main character is. Is it Chen Kaizong? Is it Mimi?
I would probably say it's Chen Kaizong, who's the interpreter for this Western firm.
But Mimi could be the protagonist as well. And the fact that it's kind of got so many different angles that it's working. So the love interest between Chen Kaizong and Mimi is definitely the lead relationship in this novel. We didn't even mention that in your plot summary because we didn't want to go on for too long. The love interest feels fake. Chen Kaizong meets Mimi and then falls in love with her. It just didn't feel real. They meet and then a couple of pages later they're like madly in love. It just kind of, there was no development. I'm sure that does happen in real life occasionally, but it just felt fake. So even with all the different themes kind of knocked out, I would be like, sorry.
Yeah, well, and that's one of where it starts to kind of go off the rails. You mentioned this weakness of science fiction to kind of sort of focus on a gimmick or a toy or a theme or something. A lot of the quote-unquote human content of the novel starts to feel a little bit like not a deus ex machina, but in order to get to this cool thing over here, I have to have a bridge. And I know, they'll fall in love. That's what'll get us there, right? But when a romantic relationship becomes a means to an end, and the end is really the cool thing, you can usually tell. And I could tell here, and we should mention this, they don't meet in a cafe or something. Kaizong is at a festival that's being, their version of the festival is being held by his clan. He comes from Silicon Isle, but he left many years ago, now has come back. And he sees this girl being harassed by a bunch of street thugs, and he goes to rescue her, and of course can't because he's a nerd. I mean, it'd be like one of us trying to rescue someone getting beaten up in an alley. That would not end well. But his uncle, who's one of the clan leaders...
You got your roll of quarters?
Yeah, at all times, my friend. I go to Paris sometimes. You got to be ready. I'd get smeared in the metro if I did that. Anyway. But, so his uncle basically saves him, and that's when they quote-unquote fall in love, and I guess the idea is that he's a local boy come back, and she's a local girl, but also kind of not, and anyway. But it does feel sort of like a means to an end. I want to mention this here, and I think we'll kind of wrap it up after this thought and then come back to it in the next episode. One of the things to look for in science fiction is, and I heard a friend of mine who's actually studied a lot of this stuff mention that in fantasy and sci-fi, a lot of what constitutes the genre is what books do with already existing elements of the genre. So in this one, you can see clear influences from a lot of earlier stuff. Classic stuff, like Fritz Lang's film Metropolis. Have you ever seen that?
No.
Silent film, but it's the same basic idea, right? This young woman becomes a leader of this oppressed working class, etc. You've done a lot more with Japanese stuff. Have you seen Akira?
Yes.
Okay, so this psychic connection to machines, this sort of post-human thing, and then a friend or at least someone nearby who's trying to save them and sort of save their humanity, that's 100% there. There's just a lot of this stuff at play. I don't know if that's intentional or not. That was one of my questions in the book. I'm like, is Chen Qiufan trying to bring up Metropolis and Akira and other things like that?
He's certainly being very elusive. I mean, he alludes to Dante. You know, we have a passage in Italian at the very beginning of this novel, Dante's Gates of Hell, that Chen Kaizong recites as he's going into a particular waste area. There are allusions to MLK, Martin Luther King. There are lots of different. This is a very elusive text, so I wouldn't be surprised. It kind of felt like the pieces of a puzzle that had been warped because they were wet and they just didn't quite fit together.
Okay, I got one more question, then we can wrap it up here. I'm trying to think if you were of the right age to have watched the cartoon Captain Planet. Did you ever watch that as a kid?
Yeah, of course.
So that was one of the other things that going through my head is this book feels like Captain Planet meets Akira. And that can't work and therefore doesn't, but I couldn't shake it. This sort of like on-the-nose environmentalism, like, oh, don't throw that can away, it'll make a dolphin sick, or something like that. You see that popping up in this novel, too. Only you also have psychic connection to machines, so it's very odd. But that was my last thing to throw in there before we wrap up.
I think that's a great place to end this episode, Rob. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.